Some young employees at the Bank of Korea began anonymously posting about the internal crisis on social media. The content, which claimed that the bank was not fulfilling its original mission and that politics was taking priority over numbers, became a hot topic, but the posts were deleted within a few days and have since been silent. In other words, even financial insiders are at a loss for words in Korea today. Hello, this is Moko. South Korea has been concluding currency swap agreements one after another, and the media is reporting on it as if the economy is strong. However, the reality is that it is nothing more than conditional debt hidden by the government. The central bank is being manipulated by the government's convenience, young people have lost hope, and the media is silent. We need to listen to the truth hidden behind economic growth. Let's take a look at the quiet collapse that lies beneath the surface of Korean society. When watching news about the Korean economy, the topic of currency swap agreements is often brought up. Agreements with the United States, a framework agreement with China, and a $56 billion swap agreement with the United Nations. The media is reporting as if South Korea has gained international credibility and its economy is strong. However, if we look at the reality calmly, it is not proof of the country's trust, but rather nothing more than debt with a credit guarantee. A currency swap is a mechanism that allows a stable currency to be borrowed from the other country and supplied to the market in the event of a sudden drop in the currency during a financial crisis. For example, a swap with the United States is a means of converting highly reliable dollars into yen, and is important for defending South Korea's foreign currency. However, many of the swap agreements concluded by South Korea in recent years are, so to speak, conditional liquidity support and are in effect loans. In fact, no full-scale swap agreement has been concluded with the United States since 2010, and currently it remains little more than a framework for cooperation in currency stabilization. Although the agreement with China is large in scale, many people believe that China's international credibility is insufficient and that it cannot be used in an emergency. Despite this, South Korean media outlets continue to report on these agreements as an indication of the stability of the South Korean economy. The $56 billion swap that the Bank of Korea concluded with the United Arab Emirates is actually conditional on its use for limited purposes such as resource development and investment, and South Korea cannot freely withdraw dollars. Reporting this as if dollar savings have increased is a serious misunderstanding for the public. There is no doubt that this structure is a strategy by the government to create a sense of security amidst the strain on national finances. Although the superficial figures of currency swaps may appear flashy, their actual content is routinely observed in the international financial arena. Swaps with Arab countries in particular are a kind of parity that is established in exchange for resources, and it is difficult to say that the terms are advantageous to South Korea. Even more serious is the nature of the South Korean economy, which is overly dependent on such swaps. Since 2023, the dollar has fallen by more than 2% against the dollar. This is by no means a small figure compared to the usual range of fluctuations. As the Bank of Korea continues to intervene in the market, there is a growing movement to use swap agreements as insurance for the dollar. However, what is truly important is a healthy economic structure that supports the credit of the domestic currency. Although South Korea has a sophisticated manufacturing industry, its export dependence and industrial structure biased toward large conglomerates are the causes of its fragility. Furthermore, domestic interest rate policy is constantly subject to political pressure. Since the independence of the Bank of Korea is not sufficiently secured, changes in the presidency or administration tend to be strongly reflected in monetary policy. It must be said that it is difficult to improve South Korea's reputation in the international market under these circumstances. Even if a currency swap agreement is concluded, it will be useless in an emergency if the country does not have the financial strength to back up its reliability and feasibility. In particular, in recent years, rating agencies and hedge funds have begun to take a cautious stance toward the Korean economy. In particular, the assessment that the agreement is a facade and not a genuine credit enhancement is gradually spreading among investors. Although the South Korean government is portraying a strong South Korean economy on the surface, there is a general sense of suspicion underlying it. And this suspicion is gradually beginning to affect the behavior of international investors. The South Korean economy is eroding the invisible capital of trust and confidence. Unless we look at the truth behind currency swap agreements, we will not be able to achieve any fundamental improvements. The currency swap agreement concluded between the South Korean government and the UAE in early 2011 caused a big stir. Its size was an astonishing $56 billion. Domestic South Korean media reported on it daily as proof of the international credibility of the South Korean economy. Experts spoke about its significance on television programs, and government officials proudly promoted it as an achievement. However, there were almost no media outlets that accurately reported on the contents of this agreement. In reality, this swap agreement was not a pure currency exchange but a commercial and strategic agreement premised on energy investment, and was not a road that South Korea could use freely. In other words, while it was ostensibly a credit enhancement of $56 billion, in reality, South Korea had offered legal compensation that included nuclear power plants, infrastructure construction, and even military cooperation in order to obtain support from the UAE. The UAE, so to speak, had presented the conditions and provided the financial backing, making it a very restrictive framework for South Korea. It would be more accurate to describe this as a swap that is close to debt. The problem is that the contents of this important contract were not communicated to the public at all. After the agreement was announced, the South Korean government explained that the UAE highly valued the stability of the South Korean economy, giving the impression that South Korea was a trusted nation and could freely obtain funds. Even in the social security issue, detailed mention of the terms and conditions of the contract was avoided, and much information was kept secret on the grounds of national security. Furthermore, the timing of the announcement coincided with a period when government approval ratings were low in South Korea. Amidst growing dissatisfaction with economic policies, the large-scale agreement with the UAE was treated as if it had been made suddenly. Perhaps the intention was to divert the public's attention from the fundamental problems of the economy. Some in the financial industry began to whisper that this was the correct view. In South Korea, citizens' lives were being hit hard by factors such as the increase in the number of young people entering the workforce and rising prices. However, the reality is that the government had failed to take effective measures to address these issues. In the midst of all this, the suddenly announced flamboyant figure of a $56 billion swap agreement was nothing more than an illusion in light of reality. Furthermore, there are problems with the reporting stance in South Korea. Ideally, the media's mission is to verify the contents of such important international agreements and carefully convey the facts to the public. However, South Korea's media outlets barely touched on the true nature of the agreement with the UAE, and continued to report only on the government's achievements. This has been attributed to the current state of South Korea's unique press club system. Under this system, reporters stationed at the government and ministries simply report official announcements, making it extremely difficult to conduct critical interviews. Since reporting content that is incompatible with the government could result in losing future reporting opportunities, many reporters routinely resort to bias. As a result, time passed without the public being informed of the strategic burdens and usage restrictions behind the agreement with the UAE, as well as the information provided by the South Korean side. Many citizens continued to trust the government, believing that they could freely use $56 billion. However, the international market is not so easy. Foreign financial institutions and rating agencies are aware that this agreement is essentially being carried out at the expense of South Korea, and they have assessed that South Korea's surgical preparations have less freedom than expected. Even more troubling is that such superficial agreements could have a negative impact on international credibility. In other words, a framework that South Korea believed would allow it to secure foreign currency in the event of a real crisis could actually become unusable. When these facts come to light, it will not be the government but the general public and businesses that will be hurt the most. South Korean small and medium-sized enterprises are already struggling with rising import costs, and there have been reports of cases where the inability to move foreign currency has caused delays in the procurement of materials and forced production to be reduced. The expectations of businesses that believe that the country would help them are being betrayed. The term currency swap sounds impressive, but what is important is whether it can actually be used. And the reality that many of the currency agreements that South Korea currently has are unusable when needed is quietly guiding the country's future. In the spring of 2023, some important news quietly caused a stir in the Korean Business Association. It was a report that Bank of Korea Governor Lee Jae-chun had been replaced midway through his term, and that a person close to the administration had been officially appointed. The government explained that this was a formal change due to a full complement of officials, but the Korean Business Association and international financial institutions believed that political pressure was behind this high-ranking decision. A central bank is supposed to ensure the independence of monetary policy. It exists to ensure price stability and the soundness of the financial system without being influenced by political trends. In particular, decisions on interest rate hikes and cuts related to inflation countermeasures and stability must be separate from the government's popularity seeking. However, the reality is that this principle is not functioning in South Korea. Governor Lee Jae-oh initially took a neutral stance when he took office, but he gradually began to make more pronounced statements distancing himself from the administration's policies. For example, at the end of 2022, he openly criticized the government's economic stimulus measures for being balanced with inflation. It is said that his relationship with the ruling party cooled after this remark, With fewer press conferences on the subject and increasing opposition from members of the Monetary Policy Committee who were more pro-government. In this context, the general view is that the plan that was suddenly proposed was effectively a high-speed rail project. An economist close to the ruling party was appointed as the official nominee. He had served as an economic policy advisor during the presidential campaign and had built a strong relationship of trust with the government. Although he stated at the press conference that he would strengthen cooperation with the government while pursuing a monetary policy that would protect the lives of the people, this was also a declaration that he would operate monetary policy in line with the transition of power. Financial professionals in South Korea remained silent in the face of this situation. Everyone had read the mood and had no choice but to keep quiet. Although the central bank's senior officials were outwardly obedient, anxiety and resignation were spreading within their ranks. A former employee, speaking anonymously, said that the current Bank of Korea is becoming more like a government department. The independence of the central bank is extremely important for international financial markets. This is because policies such as interest rate hikes and market interventions implemented for the sake of elections will undermine the credibility of the currency and in the long term will trigger inflation and a currency crash. In particular, in a country like South Korea, which has a large amount of debt, a decline in the credibility of the currency poses a direct risk to national finances. Since the resignation of the four leaders, decisions made by the Monetary Policy Board that seem to favor the transition of government have become more noticeable. For example, when the market called for an interest rate hike, the decision was made to postpone it in order to avoid burdening the people, and to continue measures to stimulate consumption despite concerns about inflation. Foreign investors and rating agencies are gradually becoming increasingly concerned about these developments. In a report in the fall of 2023, an American rating agency warned that South Korea's monetary policy neutrality was declining and that the risk of manipulation by the government was increasing. It was around this time that the decline in the value of the bank accelerated. Within the Bank of Korea, some young employees began anonymously posting about the internal crisis on social media. The content, which claimed that the bank was not fulfilling its original mission and that politics was taking priority over numbers, became a hot topic. But the posts were deleted within a few days and have since been silent. In other words, even the financial elite in Korea today are at a loss for words. This situation is also steadily affecting the lives of the people. Even as prices rise, interest rates are not raised appropriately, and the value of the currency is declining. Housing interest rates are kept half-heartedly low, and young people can no longer even dream of buying a house. Everyone knows that something is wrong, but they are busy with their daily lives without being able to address the cause. If the foundation of sound monetary policy collapses, the economy will eventually collapse with a loud noise. Signs of this are already appearing everywhere in Korea today. The South Korean currency has been gradually declining against the dollar since 2023. At first glance, the fluctuations may not seem like a major crisis, with only about 2%. However, in the world of money, this quiet decline is considered the most serious signal, especially for a country like South Korea that relies heavily on imports for resources, energy, and other resources. A Tongan rate means higher prices. So why does the rate continue to fall? Behind this lies the invisible political pressure in South Korea. The reason why the central bank is unable to raise interest rates and why monetary policy is distorted is because everything is directly linked to the government's directive rate. The government wants to make the economy look good, support businesses, and suppress dissatisfaction among young people. However, if they try to solve all of these problems by force through monetary policy, side effects will inevitably appear. For example, in order to stop the yen from depreciating, it is necessary to raise interest rates and encourage capital inflows from overseas. If an attractive interest rate can be set compared to Japan and the United States, foreign exchange movements will increase and the currency will stabilize. However, raising interest rates will place a heavy burden on households with mortgages and small and medium-sized enterprises. Amid this contradiction, the Bank of Korea is unable to make any moves. Political pressure runs even deeper. For example, the presidential office is effectively involved in the selection of members who attend the Monetary Policy Committee. The majority of members are recommended by the presidential office, and policy decisions are influenced by whether they are loyal to the government's policies. Sometimes even the committee's pseudo-power is delayed in being made public, or ambiguous language is used. The actual content of the discussions is not made known to the public, with vague language used to cover it up with neutral language such as making careful judgments in light of the international financial environment. As a result, the market gradually comes to regard South Korea's policy decisions as lacking transparency. The credibility of the economy declines, and investors withdraw funds from South Korean bonds and move to safe dollar assets. This chain reaction is the structure that supports the current low price. And the people who suffer the most are the lives of individual citizens. The cold weather has caused prices of imported goods to fall, and food, gasoline, and electricity bills have gradually risen. In supermarkets, it is not uncommon for beef that used to cost 5,000 yen to now exceed 8,000 yen. As more households refrain from eating out, people become more frugal, and the restaurant industry is taking a hit. Small and medium-sized enterprises are being forced to reduce production due to rising costs for parts and current imports, which is starting to affect employee employment. Despite this, the government insists that the economy is on the mend, and only promotes economic indicators that are controlled in a way that does not reflect the reality. There are growing concerns in some quarters that the figures in the statistical data are being manipulated intentionally. Some have pointed out that the figures that appear to show a decline in the labor force participation rate are actually an illusion caused by counting part-time workers and incompletely trained workers as trained workers, and that the actual unemployment rate is actually rising. People know this, but no one speaks up. That is the reality of Korean society today. If the yen continues to weaken, international interest rates in Korea will rise, and the government's financial burden will increase. In other words, losing trust in the currency is not just a problem of the exchange rate, but also increases the credit risk of the entire country. The horror of this slowly collapsing process is being accelerated by the culture of silence that is prevalent in Korean society. The media does not report the truth. Experts keep quiet, ordinary people endure, and everyone swallows their words while thinking that something is wrong. The dynamism and open debate that Korea once boasted of have now become externalized, and the world is changing into one where monetary policy and economic indicators are determined by the convenience of the government. A genuine economic downturn occurs in a society where no one can say anything. This is not just a decline in the currency, but maybe a sign that democracy is changing and the fundamental transformation of the economy is collapsing. The people suffering the most in Korean society right now are young people. They have been taught that studying hard, getting into a good university, and aiming to become a full-time employee is the path to success, but the harsh reality is far beyond imagination. Even with graduation on the horizon, there are only a limited number of full-time positions available, and young people continue to fail interviews because they struggle with the gap between their skills and those of the companies they work for. A binary system is developing in which those who can get a job at a few large companies, namely conglomerate companies such as Samsung, Hyundai, and SK Lada, are considered winners. Everyone else is considered an outcast. People tend to avoid finding employment at small and medium-sized companies, and the reasons for this are simple: differences in salary levels, poor benefit structures, and uncertainty about the future. Even if they want to work at a small or medium-sized company, where the working environment is harsher than that of large companies, there is no room to survive. This social structure is depriving young people of their options. In the mid-2020s, the term "in-law generation" began to take root in Korea. It refers to a generation that has given up on steps in life that were once taken for granted, such as getting a job, getting married, having children, and owning a family. Now, even expressions such as "double generation" and 20-double-law generation are being used, and society as a whole is filled with resignation. Behind this lies a sense of economic uncertainty and a sense of doubt about the social system. In South Korea, it has long been believed that only those who have survived the fierce competition for entrance exams can advance to the upper classes. Students go to cram schools until late at night, receive support from their families, and study day and night to get into university. However, what lies ahead is the reality of finding employment. The competition rate is such that only a few out of hundreds of applicants are accepted. Even if you polish your qualifications, there is no guarantee that you will be rewarded. Young people gradually lose their self-esteem. They fail repeatedly and become discouraged, working part-time jobs to earn a living while trying again. Even if they are told to have dreams, these words sound hollow in the face of reality. And the biggest reason why their suffering does not surface is because it is a society where they cannot speak up. There is a strong pressure to conform in South Korea. If you talk about your failures, you will be criticized for not trying hard enough or being lazy. And if you show your weaknesses, you will be pushed away and told not to be so spoiled. If you complain about finding a job on social media, you will be met with anonymous slander. In other words, young people are not even allowed to admit that they are struggling. Another problem is the current situation where the government and media do not try to listen to the voices of these young people. Only successful special cases are reported. A student achieves great success with a startup. A woman gets a job offer from a foreign company. Only the big stories are picked up, and the real voices of 99% of ordinary young people are left behind. Behind this lies the collusion between the media and the government. If the dissatisfaction and anger of young people are portrayed as false, it directly affects the government's approval ratings. That is why a system has been established to manipulate statistics, control the media, and eliminate criticism. For example, employment rate figures include interns and short-term contract employees, and cannot be said to accurately reflect the reality. Furthermore, there is a situation where the media is spreading propaganda that is far removed from the reality in the name of youth support policies. In 2023, a youth support fund and a program that was established a little while ago became a hot topic, but many of them were nothing more than formal training and public consultations, and did not lead to actual job losses. Even so, the government claims to be supporting them, and the anger of young people is pushed out of sight. Young people, who are supposed to be the ones supporting the future of the country, are in the most vulnerable position. That is the reality of South Korea today. They know that they are a generation that will not be rewarded, and yet, if they speak out, they will be ostracized from society. That is why they remain silent. It is this silence that speaks volumes about the depths of society's darkness. A university student said, "We are running through a tunnel without hope. But if we stop, we will be left behind. No one will look back even if we scream, so we have no choice but to run in silence." Quote, these words speak for the hearts of many young people. The silence in South Korea is not a mere coincidence. It is an atmosphere of inability to speak created by the system, and a culture of silencing voices that has been cultivated over many years. And at the heart of it all is a vast system of media control and information management. In theory, South Korea's media is classified as a free press state. However, in reality, the structure is heavily influenced by changes in the government, and reporting on important policies in particular is filtered through the press club system. Under this system, the basic style is for reporters stationed at government agencies to write articles based on announcements. In other words, rather than reporters going out to the scene and conducting their own interviews, it is more common for them to compile articles based on comments from bureaucrats and governors. There is almost no room for criticism of the government or doubts about the system. And if such critical reporting continues, there is a real risk that it will be expelled from the press club, its information provision will be terminated, and even its affiliated media outlet will have its advertising suspended or be subject to economic pressure. This structure has given rise to self-regulation of the press in South Korea. In other words, it is a society where the press draws the line on what it will not write any further. This is the true nature of South Korea's superficial freedom. This structure also has a major impact on economic reporting. The reality of currency swaps, the gap between the reporting of the security and the security of the central bank, and the political intervention of the central bank are serious issues that should be investigated by the economy and newspapers and conveyed to the public. However, the relationship between the government and the conglomerates, their power as advertising, and political favoritism have all obscured everything. A particularly problematic issue is that the public is not given information. Without information, the public apologizes for political and economic decisions. They vote while apologizing, accept policies while apologizing, and when things get tough, they cannot understand why this has happened. And this cycle further reinforces their silence. South Korea's unique credit score system also plays a significant role in censoring the press. This system, which quantifies an individual's credit and affects employment, mortgages, credit cards, insurance, etc., has an aspect of social surveillance. There have been reports that even online comments and social media posting history indirectly affect credit scores, and citizens unknowingly choose to remain silent. This structure is actually rooted in South Korea's history, a culture of superiority subordination that has continued since the mayoral era. Violations are considered acts that disrupt order, and arguments against superiors are criticized in society. This tradition has continued to exist in a different form even after the country experienced democracy. In South Korean society, reading the mood is valued, and not causing trouble is valued. This underlying psychology has influenced modern media, bureaucratic organizations, and even civil society itself. In a society where silence is considered wisdom, the truth is rarely spoken. That is why no one says anything strange. Even when the economy collapses, people are siphoned off by large corporations, or young people suffer. The government uses this silence to manipulate numbers, change the system, and win over the media. As a result, the country appears to be successful on the surface, but it is gradually rotting from the inside out. The situation is almost like Argentina at the end of the 20th century. Argentina, once considered the top student in Latin America, was putting on a facade of economic growth and international recognition, but on the inside, the problems of a financially bankrupt society were piling up. Currency swaps, IMF support, financial controls, and ultimately national default. South Korea may be standing at the very threshold of that. Everyone may think that's an exaggeration. However, collapse does not come suddenly one day. It rots quietly and little by little from the inside without anyone noticing. And by the time it's noticed, it's too late, and the silent collapse of South Korean society is happening. Perhaps this is the inevitable crisis that a nation that has chosen to remain silent faces. What did you think? Currency swaps, manipulation of statistics, and the silent media are all connected, and the nation of South Korea is quietly collapsing from within. The nation continues to move forward in an invisible crisis, with the people unaware and voiceless. What is it that we really need to protect? And what is the future that lies beyond silence? We may be facing that moment now. Please let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video. A comment posted on social media by a South American journalist caused a huge stir. One spoke with sincerity and ethics, while the other appealed with tears and Saturn. It was clear to everyone which was more trustworthy. Hello, the United Nations must pay us compensation. Those words instantly froze the air. The first thing the South Korean representative said, not about humanity or security, was anger over the past and a demand for money. What was said and what was lost in this place where the attention of the international community was focused? What remained at the end of the appeal dominated by emotion was the cold gaze of the world and the true nature of the South Korean nation. What on earth happened? Please watch until the end. In the fall of 2025, representatives from each country arrived at the United Nations headquarters in New York at the same time. Faced with serious global issues such as global warming, international conflicts, famine, and responses to pandemics, the representatives from each country waited nervously for their turn. Then, the South Korean representative, Reverend Chung-Hu, appeared on the stage. Standing on the floor, he grabbed the microphone and, uncharacteristically, declared at the beginning of the opening ceremony, "The United Nations should formally apologize to us and pay compensation. The United Nations must not turn a blind eye to the reality that we were once subject to the occupation of our territory by the imperialist nation of Japan and are still suffering from its effects." A murmur ran through the venue. Many representatives of countries looked at each other in confusion at the sudden demand for compensation, which was made without considering the main agenda items such as humanitarian assistance, security, and climate change. The representative went on to argue that the damage caused by past occupation of our territory should not be resolved solely through negotiations between countries at the time. It is an international human rights issue and a problem. Furthermore, he categorically rejected the Japan Rock Claims Settlement Agreement concluded in 1965, stating in a strong tone that the agreement was unjustly concluded by a dictatorship and is invalid in today's democratic countries. At this point, the atmosphere in the venue was clearly chilly. Although the stance of asserting historical grievances may be understandable in the international community, it was too one-sided and unusually emotional for a statement made so early in the opening ceremony. In particular, many of the representatives of developing countries wore stern expressions, as if to say, "Isn't this the place to talk about the future? What's the point of letting domestic dissatisfaction get the better of us here?" Quote. One of the American delegates muttered, "This isn't a conference. He's just giving a lecture under the guise of a speech." Quote. And when it was the turn of the Japanese representative to take the stage, everyone's eyes were fixed on Ganba. The Japanese representative, Sok-ho, first calmly expressed his gratitude to the international community, and then began his speech in a matter-of-fact manner. As the South Korean representative stated today, the claims issue was completely and finally resolved by the 1965 Japan Rock Claims Settlement Agreement. Based on this agreement, Japan provided the then South Korean government with $300 million in free aid and $200 million in economic assistance. The South Korean representatives immediately protested this statement, but the Japanese representative did not respond. This agreement was concluded with the formal consent of both governments based on international law. If treaties are reinterpreted or abandoned in the international community based on emotional arguments, the international order itself will collapse. Each word carried weight, and many of the delegates listening nodded in agreement. However, the South Korean representative raised his voice on the spot and shouted again through the microphone that such an agreement was not the consensus of the South Korean people. This exchange was immediately reported by media outlets around the world, with headlines such as "South Korean representatives unilaterally raise historical issues at UN conference, make abusive remarks denying international treaties." One South Korean representative made the following remark in an informal setting after the conference: "There is nothing wrong with bringing up past issues. However, the way they did it showed no international maturity. It is a shame to make such emotional claims at the UN." In this way, South Korea not only failed to get its claims across at the UN, but also lost the trust and support of many countries. Gradually, the South Korean delegation became isolated, and in the latter half of the conference, they quietly disappeared without being asked for their opinions by almost anyone. The UN is a place where calmness, logic, and trust prevail. South Korea was once again confronted with the reality that letting out emotions there would not only strengthen its own assertiveness, but would actually disadvantage its own position. The figure of the Japanese representative, Ishii, standing on the floor, was imbued with an air of unshakable serenity and calm solemnity. The South Korean representative had made a series of emotional remarks just before, so much attention was focused on his first words. Today, I hope that constructive discussions will take place on the issues facing the world. First, I would like to explain the circumstances to everyone from each country. The atmosphere in the room calmed down. Sincere discussions eased the tension of the gathering and drew out an attitude of listening. Representative Tanaka spoke carefully and without rushing. Now, the South Korean representative mentioned the Japan Rock Claims Settlement Agreement concluded in 1965. I have a responsibility to clarify the facts on this point. Representative Tanaka picked up the document he had been complimenting and stated clearly. The Japan ROC Claims Settlement Agreement stipulates that any issues concerning claims between the two countries have been completely and finally resolved. This agreement was formally concluded by the governments of both countries in accordance with international law and ratified by the parliaments of both countries. He spoke calmly but strongly. Based on this agreement, Japan provided economic cooperation totaling $800 million, including $300 million in grants, $200 million in grants, and private loans. This was far more than the national budget of South Korea at the time. These words caused a shock from several countries in South Korea. Many of the delegates from Latin America and Africa were unaware of the extent of Japan's support at the time. The South Korean government used this money at its own discretion for domestic infrastructure development, industrial development, education, healthcare, and other purposes. As you all know, the result was an economic development known as the tourism miracle. In this way, Representative Tanaka calmly and clearly demonstrated that Japan had made a major contribution to the modernization of South Korea and the improvement of its people's lives, not just through simple monetary payments. Furthermore, Representative Tanaka continued to use logic based on law and facts rather than emotion. A treaty is a promise made to fulfill a responsibility for the future based on the trust of state officials. To unilaterally deny this would fundamentally shake the rule of law. Representatives from many European countries nodded deeply at this statement. There was a common understanding among international leaders that respect for treaties was an absolute principle and that it was absolutely unacceptable to overturn it based on emotion. As the South Korean delegate stated, it is true that the government at the time was a military regime. However, the South Korean government at the time was a member of the United Nations and a member of the international community. And after the agreement was signed, successive South Korean governments have repeatedly failed to confirm this. Furthermore, Representative Tanaka also mentioned past apologies. The Japanese government has repeatedly expressed deep remorse and apologies for its past colonial rule. This has been done in good faith in the 1995 Murayama Declaration, the 1998 Japan ROC Joint Declaration, and the 2015 Japan ROC Agreement. The atmosphere in the room clearly changed to one of listening and sympathizing with the calm remarks made by the Japanese representative. One of the South Korean delegation members who was watching this could not hide his irritation and signaled a lecture to the chairman. However, the chairman ignored it at all and urged Representative Tanaka to continue speaking. We hope for a Japan ROC relationship that is forward-thinking. It is important to face the past squarely, but at the same time, a relationship of trust that embodies laws and promises is essential for walking together toward the future. There was no emotional element in his words. However, it clearly showed the stance of a nation that values rules and responsibilities in the international community. This calm and sincere attitude is the strength of Japan's diplomacy and the reason why it is highly regarded even at the United Nations. After leaving the UN, I was impressed by the words spoken by a Nordic diplomat to the media. The words of the South Korean representative were filled with anger, but the words of the Japanese representative contained history, responsibility, and the future. Japan responded not with emotion but with facts and sincerity. And the world did not miss it. After Ishigane finished his remarks, a moment of silence fell over the venue. Immediately afterwards, a small round of applause erupted from several European countries, which gradually spread to the surrounding areas. Applause is rare in a diplomatic setting such as the UN, and it showed how rational and sympathetic Japan's remarks were. Upon hearing the applause, the expression on the face of the South Korean representative, Chong, turned grim and he quickly spoke something to Ishii's assistant. His face showed his anxiety at the fact that things were heading in a completely different direction than expected. After the representatives of the chair countries had prepared the stage, the next speaker was the American representative, Morgan. He spoke cautiously but with clear intent. Our country values the relationship of trust with our two allies, Japan and South Korea. However, we believe that actions that call a treaty invalid in the international community will cause extremely serious problems. If emotions become the norm to overturn the agreement of state officials, the world will be filled with chaos and suspicion. This statement from the United States was a real blow to the heart. In the past, South Korea would have used the fact that the United States was behind it as a diplomatic shield, but that day was different. No country agreed with South Korea's claims anymore. Furthermore, the representative of Germany stood up quietly and added, "Our country has made clear apologies and guarantees in order to avoid repeating the historical apologies of the past, and has made many efforts both domestically and internationally to carry them on into the future. However, this is an action based on the rule of law, and is different from unilaterally denying an international agreement. Keeping promises. That is the power of trust." As South Korea's position continued to deteriorate, Representative Jang took the microphone again and desperately retorted, "And yet our country is suffering. Japan has not truly reflected. Our voices have continued to be ignored." However, those voices no longer reached anyone's hearts. The surrounding countries quietly took notes, some lowered their eyes, and others simply looked away. Is this what it means to be isolated in an international force? It was later reported that some members of the South Korean delegation made such remarks. Representatives of South Asian countries showed particularly positive reactions. Some of these countries have rapidly strengthened their economic relations with South Korea in recent years, but they clearly distanced themselves from the remarks. The representatives are said to have spoken off the record. Each country is free to interpret its own past however it wants, but trying to make other countries compensate for it with money is not the diplomacy of a modern nation. There were even criticisms from African delegations that South Korea had lost its sense of humility as one of the countries that had received aid. The representative of the EU presidency also said the following at a press conference: "The Japan-South Korea issue has been resolved based on an agreement that was historically concluded between the parties. While we appreciate Japan's calm diplomatic stance, we believe that we should be cautious about actions by the highest authorities that could shake the international order." In response to these reactions from these countries, the atmosphere at the UN became completely unfavorable to South Korea. International media also reported on the situation extensively. The British BBC ran a headline saying that South Korea failed to gain international understanding with its emotional claims, while France's Le Monde wrote that it was clear which side won over law and emotion. A comment posted on social media by a South American journalist caused a huge stir. One spoke with sincerity and logic, while the other appealed with tears and Saturn. It was clear to everyone which side would win trust. The incident was also broadcast live in South Korea, and the hashtags "embarrassing" and "isolated at the UN" were trending on social media for a while. However, the South Korean government maintained a strong stance despite the situation, and Representative Jang said at a press conference after returning to Japan, "Justice for South Korea will definitely reach the world." Today's response is just the first step. There was no applause for his words. Instead, the media calmly distanced themselves, and commentators sternly stated that the reckless demand for compensation had damaged national interests. In this way, South Korea made one-sided, emotional claims at the UN, an international force, and lost the trust of the world, deepening its isolation. Immediately after his remarks at the UN were met with global criticism, the repercussions were certain to hit South Korea as well. The reaction from the business community was particularly notable. The Seoul stock market saw a sharp drop in the exchange rate the day after the remarks. It fell below 1,400 against the dollar, reaching its most unstable level since the 2020s. Defiant investment funds and institutional investors all withdrew their funds from the South Korean market. An executive at a deceptive investment bank told South Korean media that the UN remarks were too risky and had destroyed the trust relationship with the international community. The destabilization of the market caused import costs to rise, which in turn spread to energy and food prices. The lives of ordinary people became even more difficult, with the inflation rate jumping to 7.3% year-on-year. The government implemented import intervention as a countermeasure, but the resulting decline in foreign exchange reserves was also serious. According to the latest announcement, foreign exchange reserves as of October 2012 were $311 billion. Although the situation appears stable, in reality, the reserves available for transit defense are decreasing, and the market is concerned about this as a hidden crisis. Furthermore, despite this situation, the South Korean government has shown no sign of opening the door to economic cooperation with Japan. Rather, some South Korean media outlets have begun to argue that Japan's retaliatory attitude is putting pressure on the South Korean economy, further fueling emotional conflict. However, in reality, Japan has not taken any new economic measures, and this was the result of South Korea's unilateral diplomatic failure. The South Korean economy has always been extremely dependent on exports, and production systems cannot be maintained without the supply of materials and equipment from Japan, especially in sectors such as reactionary steel, automobiles, and steel. When Japan tightened its export controls in 2019, South Korean small and medium-sized enterprises were forced to suspend operations due to the current shortage, which is still fresh in our memory. Despite this, improving relations with Japan is considered a political taboo, and public opinion against bowing down to Japan has gained a certain amount of power under the current administration. In addition, the country's birth rate has been declining and the population has been aging rapidly. The winning percentage has fallen to 0.68, the lowest in the world. With the population shrinking and the number of workers decreasing, serious doubts were being raised about the sustainability of the pension and healthcare systems. It was also becoming increasingly difficult for young people to find employment, and in Seoul, a competitive society known as Spec Hell, an increasing number of young people were unable to secure regular employment after graduating from university and were instead stuck in non-regular employment. As a result, the number of people giving up on marriage and childbirth was increasing, and society's vitality was significantly lost. Quote, "Does this country have a future?" These questions were being asked repeatedly in street cafes and online message boards. Meanwhile, the media environment was also changing. Some TV stations and newspapers that had previously been pro-government began to intensify their criticism of the government after its failure at the UN. One of them stated in a sermon, "The remarks made by our country's representatives at the international force were not an appeal for justice, but a diplomatic defeat. The days when shouting anger at Japan would earn applause are over. What is needed is a calm strategy and the re-establishment of trust." In response to these arguments, government officials began to attack the media, calling them anti-national and neo-Japanese. However, at the same time, doubts about the government's stance were gradually growing among the public. In an interview with Saul Street, a man in his 20s said, "What we want is not yelling. We want realistic policies that will make our lives easier and diplomatic skills that will connect us with the world." Another woman said, "We've been attacking Japan for so long, but when you think about it, do you feel like our lives have actually improved? I don't think it's time for that to happen anymore." Domestic public opinion was definitely changing. On the one hand, ruling party members and some civic groups continued to call for the country not to forget the history for which there has been insufficient apology. However, behind these voices, there was no longer the overwhelming enthusiasm or belief in justice that there used to be. Pride began to be seen in every field, including the economy, population, society, and diplomacy, and many citizens were finally beginning to realize that all of this was being fueled by emotional diplomacy with Japan. The Japan-ROK Treaty is invalid. The moment the South Korean representative uttered these words at the United Nations, shock ran through diplomats and experts in international law. This was not just a political statement, but a declaration that fundamentally denied the agreement of state officials. This claims agreement is a treaty concluded in Tokyo on June 22, 1965. And was agreed upon at the same time that Japan and the Republic of Korea normalized their relations. Its official name is the Agreement on Claims and Economic Cooperation between Japan and the Republic of Korea. The confidence of this agreement lies in the fact that it sings of the complete and final settlement of claims held by the governments and peoples of both countries against the other country and its people. This article clearly states that the two contracting parties confirm that no claims whatsoever may be made between the two countries and their peoples concerning property rights and claims. This wording that no claims may be made has an extremely strong binding force legally. In other words, in exchange for Japan waiving its claims to Korea for the assets and infrastructure it left behind during its rule of the Korean Peninsula, Korea's claims for compensation are also terminated. In return, Japan provided Korea with other funds and technology in the form of economic cooperation. So why is Korea now denying this agreement? The Korean side argues that this agreement was a dictatorship and did not reflect the will of the people. It does not even waive individual claims. Various issues are raised, such as Japan not having made a genuine apology. While it is true that there are complex circumstances surrounding the feelings of the people and how they deal with history, from the perspective of international law, treaties concluded by nations have legal binding force regardless of the political legitimacy of the government. In fact, after this agreement, the South Korean government responded by providing compensation to forced laborers as the responsibility of the state. In fact, the South Korean government paid security deposits to domestic non-conscripted laborers and bereaved families in the 1970s. And it has been confirmed in internal South Korean government documents that economic cooperation funds from Japan were used to cover the payment. In other words, there is irrefutable evidence that South Korea itself fulfilled the agreement. Furthermore, the ruling by the Korea National University in 2018 ordering Japanese companies to pay compensation to former conscripted laborers also drew international criticism. The Japanese government clearly protested this as a violation of international law and proposed to South Korea that an intermediate court proceeding involving a third country be brought into the case. But South Korea rejected this. The important point here is South Korea's argument that individual claims remain. It is true that the Japan-ROK Claims Settlement Agreement does not state that individual claims have been extinguished, but this only means that legal rights remain, and does not guarantee that a person will win a lawsuit. In a 2007 ruling, the Japanese Supreme Court also stated that while individual claims formally remain, they have lost their enforceability in court due to the law on diplomatic protection. This is a common understanding among scholars and former bureaucrats in South Korea, and it is not a matter of debate, but rather a matter that has already been settled from a legal perspective. Furthermore, the $300 million in economic cooperation funds provided by Japan is said to be worth at least 2 trillion yen in current currency terms, and Japan has continued to provide support over a long period of time, including dispatching engineers, providing supplies, and providing ODA and educational support. Despite this, the fact that this support has been provided is rarely reported in South Korea, and the misunderstanding that Japan has done nothing as a country is spreading. In fact, a South Korean university student said, "I didn't know that Japan had apologized or made any guarantees. I was never taught about that at school or on the news." This kind of biased information has created misunderstandings and anger that transcend generations, and it has also affected countries' diplomats. However, the international community's eyes are strict and calm. A treaty is an absolute promise to secure trust as a nation, regardless of historical background or changes in government. To call it invalid is tantamount to destroying one's own credibility as a nation. In that sense, every time South Korea makes a fuss about the issue being unresolved, the world becomes more convinced that Japan's position is correct, and this ironic phenomenon is now a reality. Several weeks have passed since the South Korean representative's statement at the UN, and the international community's reaction has clearly divided into two camps. However, this does not mean that there is a consensus for or against, but rather that Japan's reputation is rising while South Korea's credibility is being lost. A former European ambassador to the UN said this in an interview. "It goes without saying which country is trusted by the international community, a country that breaks treaties or a country that abides by them. Japan is a nation that understands not only the interests of the world but also the importance of trust. Since World War II, Japan has sincerely faced up to its past mistakes and has repeatedly apologized and provided assurances without delay. Japan's ODA to Asian countries is one of the largest in the world, and it also provides dedicated support in the fields of technical assistance, education, and medicine. In particular, Japan has invested its technology and funds in infrastructure development, transportation systems, communications, energy, and education, all of which were funded by the massive economic cooperation provided by the Claims Settlement Agreement." However, South Korean politics has only seen the benefits of this as Japanese food, and has repeatedly maintained that Japan has not apologized enough, but the days when this would work are over. Meanwhile, South Korea has become increasingly diplomatically isolated since its statement at the UN, and its economic credibility has also been on a downward trend. In particular, South Korean companies have increasingly turned away from the country, and the trend of shifting investment to Vietnam and Indonesia has accelerated. It is common knowledge in the business world that the future cannot be entrusted to an unstable country. The rapid increase in the labor force, the increase in the number of young people entering the workforce, the acceleration of the declining birth rate, and the government's pro-Japanese stance. All of these factors have created a negative chain reaction that is casting a shadow over South Korea's future. However, the South Korean government has not changed its stance. Rather, it has further strengthened its high-handed stance, declaring that it will continue to raise its voice until Japan changes. However, these words no longer evoke the same level of enthusiasm from the people as they once did. A month after the UN speech, a civic group held a demonstration in Seoul demanding an apology for Japan's withdrawal, but only about 200 people participated. The sight of thousands gathering as in the past was no longer seen, and the media avoided giving it much attention. Instead, posts by young people on social media attracted attention. While we were still waking up, Japan was moving forward into the future. We can't stop dwelling on the past. What more can we ask of a country that has sincerely apologized and even provided support? On the other hand, Japan continued to be quietly praised. Japan did not give in to emotional statements or provocations at all, and maintained a calm and consistent attitude toward both the international community and domestically. Its stance of calmly presenting the political legitimacy of the Japan-ROK Agreement, apologies for the past, specific figures and history of economic cooperation, and upholding the principles of the international order earned trust and respect from around the world. Furthermore, Japan continued to send a message that it wanted to continue future-oriented cooperation in the international arena without blaming South Korea. As an African representative said, it was clear to the world that Japan was extending its hand in good faith, while South Korea was rejecting it. And at the 2026 UN General Assembly, Japan was given the opportunity to speak as a leading country on the agenda regarding humanitarian and humanitarian assistance activities. The Japanese representative said, "We learn from the past and take responsibility for the future. Cooperation is realized through trust and sincerity." The men gave a big round of applause, and the South Korean delegation could only watch in silence. It symbolized the arrival of an era in which attitudes, not words, are evaluated differently. If South Korea had been sincere and spoken about the future rather than the past, it might have been evaluated differently. However, diplomacy that relies solely on anger and emotion will not gain trust or support. The world is calm and sees history in numbers, and Japan is a country that gets back up even after falling. It is a country that builds its future over and over again with the power of sincerity and trust. What did you think? Emotional claims may create temporary enthusiasm. However, what is truly evaluated is calmness, sincerity, and the attitude of keeping promises. What Japan gained by sticking to these principles was quiet respect, and what South Korea lost was irreplaceable trust. Choosing your future depends on your determination at this moment. Please let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.